The body of Julius Caesar lies mangled on the Senate floor, blood pooling around 23 stab wounds. The man history remembers as Rome's brilliant statesman has just been slaughtered by the very elite he claimed to challenge. Yet in the shadows, something far more calculated is happening. As senators flee and slaves whisper, documents are already being prepared, speeches, histories, and mythologies that will transform this brutal power grab into Rome's most glorious martyrdom. This isn't just another assassination. It's the birth of history's most successful propaganda campaign. The real Julius Caesar wasn't the democratic hero or military genius we've been sold. He was Rome's first true Antichrist, a man who knowingly destroyed a republic to crown himself a living god. The knife still glints in the torchlight of memory, and yet the story you learned in school moves on as if nothing messy ever happened. That sudden image of Caesar on the Senate floor rarely appears in the neat timeline printed on textbooks. You were shown a cleaner arc: victories, reforms, tragedy. Now the film rewinds to that tidy version and plays it on the classroom screen, a version that comforts and explains. According to every polished documentary and most school syllabi, Julius Caesar stands at the apex of Roman greatness. He is the unstoppable general who brought Gaul under Rome's control, adding territory measured in hundreds of thousands of square miles. He is the reformer who fixed a chaotic calendar, rebuilt roads and forums, and handed out land to the needy. He is the politician who dared to challenge a rotten Senate and to speak for the common people. He crosses the Rubicon, and we call it courage. He reforms the state, and we call it genius. He dies on the Ides of March, betrayed by enemies and a tragic circle of friends, and we call it martyrdom. Imagine the opening shots of that familiar film. A sweeping map unfurls, rivers, forests, cities that blink into Roman control. There are grand tableaus of legions in perfect formation, banners snapping in the wind, and Caesar's face rendered larger than life on coin and statue. A narrator's voice, calm, authoritative, declares that Rome found its savior in a man who loved his people and reimagined an empire. The official script is economical. It erases awkward details and stitches the rest into a narrative that comforts. Rome was saved by a bold leader. The Republic dissolved only because it needed to become more efficient. Caesar's reforms become inevitable steps in history's progress. The brutality of conquest is visible, but presented as collateral to glory. Grief and rage at his murder are framed as popular, spontaneous, righteous. The crowds in the forum do not question the mechanics of power. They display a raw, human grief that justifies the rest. Listen to the voices the cameras used to sell that story. A university professor on camera: Caesar's genius was institutional. He restructured Rome's calendar, its economy, its public works. Those are the markers of a statesman. A historian in a documentary voiceover: when the Republic faltered, Rome needed someone to step forward. Caesar filled that vacuum. A film narrator, slightly more poetic: he was betrayed. Yes, but betrayed at the height of his glory. His life a tragic note that transformed him into something more than mortal. These are the official lines, shaped to be memorable and uncontroversial. They are short, resonant, and easily replayed in classroom lectures and documentary montages. They turn complication into emblem. The cinematic classroom leans on a few reliable visuals: the siege works at Alesia, the triumphal entry into Rome, the marble face on coins, a slow-motion cross of the Rubicon. Each image does work. They are real events, real artifacts. The problem is not that these images exist. The problem is how they are arranged and for what purpose. This version of Caesar is not neutral. It comforts three audiences at once. First, it comforts the state, an orderly explanation for how authority could be consolidated and legitimized. Second, it comforts empire builders. Rulers across centuries can point to Caesar and say, "Look, order, reform, glory." Third, it comforts culture makers. Poets, artists, novelists, and filmmakers find in Caesar an archetype that sells well: charismatic leader, tragic fall, romantic entanglement with Cleopatra. All three reward the same tidy myth. A classroom scene helps show how the myth is taught. A teacher lights a slide. Caesar reformer, general, martyr. Students nod. The slide lists achievements. Julian calendar, roads and buildings, land laws for poor veterans, extension of Roman citizenship. Questions are politely quelled. Older debates about casualties and power grabs are relegated to the footnotes. The moral of the lesson is obvious and palatable. Strong leadership delivers stability and prosperity. Too short, synthetic quotations capture the tone the official story aims for. A textbook blurb. Julius Caesar transformed Rome by blending military genius with benevolent reform. A museum plaque. A leader of unmatched vision, Caesar rebuilt civic life and redefined Rome's future. Both lines are designed to settle debate and to fossilize judgment. When you watch the neat version, you feel that events are rational, that chaos has been tamed. The narrative does a particular kind of work. It reduces moral complexity, isolates Caesar's achievements from their human cost, and neutralizes long-term institutional damage. The myth is slippery because it mixes truth with carefully selected omissions. It uses real achievements as scaffolding while allowing darker actions to remain offstage. Who benefits from this arrangement? The list is telling. Emperors centuries later lean on Caesar as precedent. Monarchs and autocrats claim him as a model for strong executive action. The Church, when it grew into imperial structures, found in Caesar a figure to be reconciled power converted into sanctity. Later nation-states and revolutionary leaders used Caesar's image to legitimize centralized authority. And modern entertainment film studios, streaming services, history publishers profit enormously from the sensational, heroic version that cuts through nuance. The myth also performs a civic function. It recasts a violent takeover as a necessary modernization. It tells citizens that their suffering or exclusion was part of a larger, useful design. It offers a comforting logic. When systems fail, extraordinary individuals can step in. That logic will reappear in every era that prefers decisive action over messy deliberation. Yet the official story is structured as omission more than falsehood. It is not a single lie, but a choreography of emphasis. Lift this fact, hide that deed, rehearse a speech, stage a funeral, let the public cry. Over time, the choreography becomes habit. Statues multiply, coins circulate, schoolchildren memorize dates. The myth ossifies. You have seen this version in documentaries. You have seen it in films that glamorize conquest. You may have seen Caesar in a museum, in a classroom, on a textbook cover, and felt small doubt at a detail that never quite sits right. The official story is polished, but it leaves unanswered what price was paid to create that order, and for whom? Before we look closer at the cracks, a brief personal ask. Thank you for watching this investigation so far. This channel is new and relies on viewers like you. If you believe more hidden histories should see the light, please subscribe and help us reach our first 1,000 supporters so we can keep digging and publishing. Your support matters. It turns solitary curiosity into sustained research. The next act walks us away from the comforting montage and into the archive room. There, dry records and awkward numbers interrupt the polished narrative. The cracks are small at first: discrepancies in casualty counts, odd omissions in laws, but they grow, and they force a different question. If the polished story is wrong in places, what else has been smoothed over? You were taught the polished version because it is satisfying. The following pages will show you the parts the story leaves out and why those omissions matter. The first cracks appear like ink bleeding through fine paper, small stains that, when followed, reveal an entire forgery. Start with arithmetic, because numbers rarely lie quietly. Ancient chroniclers credit Caesar with staggering totals. That scarcity does not mean absence of complexity. It signals an imbalance in who got to write history. The conqueror's voice is loudest because it had a press, resources, and motive. Next, look at Caesar's reforms and ask, for whom were they intended? The textbooks celebrate land redistribution and debt relief. But the paperwork shows patterns that indicate selective generosity. Land grants often favored veterans, men who had marched under Caesar's banners and whose continued loyalty was essential. Debt relief was broad in language, but narrow in application. Loans owed to powerful allies were frequently exempt. The political calculus is visible. Redistribute to cement loyalty among those who matter. Leave influential creditors whole. This is not innocent administrative choice. It is the architecture of clientelism. Caesar's reforms built networks of dependence. Veterans received plots and status in newly reconfigured local governments. Those plots did not become independent citizens, but nodes of allegiance tied to a single patron. The Republic's centuries-old mechanisms of representation and accountability began to shift. Authority concentrated not in institutions, but in a person whose favors determined economic survival. Then there is the paradox labeled clemency. Caesar prided himself on pardoning political foes in Rome, a dramatic virtue in a culture that prized magnanimity. The stories emphasize forgiveness. He forgave enemies who might otherwise die. It was a brilliant public relations move, mercy framed as moral transcendence. Yet the ledger from his military campaigns tells a harsher tale. In Gaul, accounts some reported by contemporaries like Plutarch and later chroniclers describe mass enslavement, mutilation orders, and punitive massacres. Was Caesar merciful at home because mercy advanced his domestic image? Did brutality abroad secure resources and eliminate resistance? The timeline reveals more. Examined closely, many of the systemic changes associated with reform appear only after military victories and subsequent consolidation. That sequence suggests these acts were rewards or instruments of governance after power had been seized, not pre-existing policy commitments that justified grabbing power in the first place. In other words, the reforms often read as benefits dispensed from position of supremacy, not as a moral program fought for at the ballot box. Another fissure opens in the constitutional record. The Republic's institutions were deliberately designed to share power and prevent concentration. Consuls rotated, magistrates were checked, senatorial prerogatives persisted. Caesar's accumulation of roles, he held numerous positions simultaneously that were designed to limit each other, was constitutional sleight of hand. This stacking of offices was not a minor breach. It was a systematic undermining of the Republic's foundational architecture. If you learn Caesar as a savior of the state, consider instead the procedural truth. The more titles he took, the weaker the checks became. Elections were sidelined in important districts, magistrates were appointed rather than chosen, and the Senate was increasingly packed with allies. Each move had a veneer of legality, because laws and votes were used to rubber stamp acts that hollowed out the Republic's mechanisms. That is the hallmark of a particular authoritarian technique, retaining form while subverting function. Look at how opponents were treated, and the result is chilling. The Republic provided for political speech, for public debate. Caesar's Rome offered a theater of debate to expose critics, then used the records to punish them. Criticism in the open forum became an intelligence report in his hands. Senators who dared to oppose him sometimes found themselves subject to audits, legal harassment, or financial pressure. The pattern was surgical and systematic. Scale is another problem. Ancient chroniclers boast of 1,000,000 Gauls killed or enslaved in sweeping phrases. Modern historians treat such numbers with caution. Ancient numeracy and rhetorical inflation are well known. Yet the scale of suffering remains enormous by any conservative estimate. Hundreds of thousands displaced, thousands executed, whole communities uprooted. Whether the final toll is 200,000 or 1,000,000, the moral impression is inescapable. The Gallic campaigns inflicted catastrophic human cost. That truth sits uneasily beside images of Caesar as benevolent reformer. Turn to the sources, and you'll find another wedge. Much of our accepted narrative flows from Caesar's own pen and from biographers like Suetonius and Plutarch, who wrote under imperial patronage or within systems that rewarded flattering memory. Their accounts are invaluable, but contain an editorial thumb. Letters survive correspondence with allies, invoices for games and spectacles, lists of proposed honors documents where Caesar's aim is naked, secure prestige. And he used spectacle as a political tool, triumphs, public games, and minted portraits, all instruments to anchor memory in certain directions. Consider the innovation of placing a living man's image on coins. In the Republic, coinage carried gods, symbols, and the state. Caesar put his face and name on currency. That was not mere vanity. It was a seismic symbolic act. Money is the most mundane yet pervasive medium of propaganda. A citizen handling a denarius with Caesar's visage encountered daily a reminder of who mattered. The message circulated with commerce. There are absences that speak louder than declarations. In many places where victories and rescues are claimed, indigenous voices vanish. The names of subjugated peoples are reduced to footnotes or catalog entries. Their leaders become tribal chiefs in Roman shorthand, stripped of political context. Entire communities disappear from the archive. Is that an accident of preservation or the consequence of a narrative that never wanted them to matter? Again, the question is not whether Caesar achieved real reforms. He did. The Julian calendar improved civil administration. Infrastructure projects had real economic value. But the effect of those reforms cannot be disentangled from their political function. They were instruments to knit networks of loyalty and to justify the concentration of authority. Reforms doubled as rewards. Public works were monuments to his name. One striking contradiction comes in his supposed populism. Populist rhetoric, we're told, was his hallmark appeal to the people, champion the poor. Yet his inner circle included plutocrats like Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's richest man. Financial backing from elites enabled Caesar's career. Loans, patronage, and reciprocal favors built his base. His policies sometimes harmed entrenched oligarchic interests, yes, but often in ways that reshaped advantage toward those already allied with him. The economic foundations of his power were a tangled web of elite cooperation and public performance. Now consider the Rubicon itself. The drama surrounding the crossing is a key hinge in the story we revere. Legend, flair, and Shakespearean lines grafted meaning onto the moment. But the act was constitutionally unambiguous. A provincial commander bringing legions into Italy was treason. The choice Caesar faced was not rhetorical grandstanding. It was a legal ultimatum. The die was cast not in defense of some higher republican ideal, but as a deliberate decision to convert legal peril into military advantage. That crossing had cascading consequences. The precedent was fatal to republican norms because it established practical politics by force. Power could be won and held by arms. Subsequent generations learned the lesson well. The balance between civilian institutions and military force tipped decisively toward the sword. The Republic's mechanisms of negotiation, compromise, and law became secondary to the loyalty of soldiers to a charismatic commander. We should also talk about timing. Many reforms and honors that seem magnanimous occurred not during Caesar's early political career, but after his armies returned triumphant. That sequencing suggests that policies served as currency to placate, buy, and bind people to him. The claim that his reforms were the cause of his rise leans into wishful teleology. The facts, when ordered by time, more plausibly show policy as consequence. A crucial point to stress is not to confuse effectiveness with legitimacy. Caesar may have solved immediate administrative problems and may have governed efficiently in places. But effectiveness does not confer moral or constitutional legitimacy. Both perspectives recognize truth. Rome's institutions were stressed, but the means by which power was concentrated mattered. The distinction is one between diagnosis and cure. Caesar claimed to cure the republic. The cure, in practice, killed it. By the close of these initial probes, one fact becomes clear. The glossy legend cannot survive unexamined. The discrepancies are not marginal. They point to a purposeful pattern of institutional capture. You can still admire tactical brilliance or administrative competence, but admiration does not excuse the mechanics of how power was seized and maintained. So far we have not yet met him behind closed doors, how he worked the levers, who he rewarded, and what conversations were had in dim rooms where law turned into strategy. Those scenes belong to the next section, the backstage, where reputation was manufactured and loyalty purchased. There, the most revealing evidence waits: ledgers, letters, and small acts of intimidation that together explain how a republic was quietly hollowed out while its people applauded reforms. Morning in Rome, before the curule chairs catch the sun, Julius Caesar's household already smells of ink and oil. Lamps gutter in narrow rooms where men run fingers along wax tablets, where slaves carry folded bundles of correspondence, where a steady, muffled churn of information arrives and is sorted. It is not a single grand plan being revealed, but dozens of small acts, letters copied, rumors confirmed, favors tallied that together form the architecture of power. In the archival quiet, the machinery of a personal regime hums like a hidden engine. Every day began with a stack, reports from provincial governors, updates from legates in Gaul, summaries of senatorial murmurs. He read to measure loyalty. The names that recur: Crassus, Pompey, long lists of centurions read as a ledger of obligation. He did not merely receive intelligence, he curated it. A hostile remark in a private corner of the Senate became a public accusation when it suited him. Praise that could be circulated was polished and set into bronze. One of the most revealing habits, reported by observers and echoed in surviving fragments, is ordinary and chilling. He kept dossiers. Who spoke for whom? Who owed whom favors? Who had debts that could become leverage? Everything recorded like entries in an audit. Here, in the interstices between ritual and law, the real power grew. Take the seemingly mundane work of arranging land for veterans. The textbooks laud it as charity. In the back rooms, it looks like bookkeeping. Parcels were chosen not only for fertility, but for their potential to create nodes of dependence. Soldiers settled in frontier colonies, near roads and garrisons that owed their existence to the general who had secured them. Those settlers became a mobile political body tied by gratitude, land, and the memory of shared campaigns. Rewarding veterans is not an act of compassion alone. It is an investment in a private base. Money moved like weather, ubiquitous and shaping. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, financed ventures and expected laws to follow. Loans were not abstract. They were cash laid on the table before elections, the circulatory system of patronage. Caesar borrowed, repaid, defaulted tactically. One dossier notes sums advanced to pay soldiers' arrears after winter campaigns, sums arranged through Gallic financiers called in as favor to Rome. In other words, credit that looked like public service but functioned as private preservation. The state paid the bill. The general collected the loyalty. Power also required spectacle. You have seen the reframed triumphs in films, processions of captured standards, chests of gold, vanquished for display. In real life, those processions were rehearsed narratives. Commemorative games required precise budgets and carefully timed gestures. Freedmen receiving grain, actors reciting the general's heroic lines, a carved image placed on a coin. The use of everyday items, bread rations, public games, distributions of oil served as constant reminders that Caesar, not an institution, provided. People queued at grain distributions, and left with the name and face of their benefactor etched into the transaction. There was also a ruthless intelligence network that was less visible. Informants were not only gladiators and lowly clerks. They were freedmen of senatorial families, clients who still attended houses of power, foreign merchants who could report on shipments and allegiances. Spies returned with words, gestures, sloppy tempers, small things that betrayed deeper alliances. He read these missives not simply to anticipate plots, but to preempt them. A senator who mouthed a resentful phrase in a dining room found, a week later, a sudden audit or a challenged will. It wasn't always murder. Subtle removal worked better. Reputations eroded, debts surfaced, alliances frayed. The private and the public blurred in his person. You know the anecdote. He wept before Alexander's tomb, moved by a sense of being outstripped in glory. That private grief is important because it reveals motive. Vanity is not cosmetic. It is combustible. That hunger for recognition translated into policies and performances that secured immortality by other means: statue, triumph, coin. To place his image on coinage while alive was to convert commerce into worship. Every transaction then carried his imprint. This network had muscle and a kind of theater. Publius Clodius and his street cohorts were not mere thugs. They were a political instrument. They disrupted assemblies, attended games in numbers that suggested mass affection, intimidated opponents into silence or exile. When political argument turned into street violence, the law no longer seemed the primary arbiter. Masks of civic ritual were maintained while the instruments of coercion worked in the alleys. In that world, fear and favor ran parallel tracks. Yet contradictions permeated these rooms. The same man who practiced clemency in dramatic public pardons could authorize wholesale brutality beyond Rome's forum. Reports from Gaul and Germany recall campaigns where surrender was not mercy but a prelude to enslavement, where the promise of safety was a tool that permitted capture and resale. Mercy in the city made for headlines. Cruelty on the frontier paid for the headlines. That dissonance shows calculation. One face for Rome, another for the peripheries that provided the means to project power. His private rituals grew bolder over time. Suetonius records subtle preferences: purple garments, honors typically reserved for gods and kings, the willingness to accept temples and statues. Even these were staged with a legalistic patina. Votes were taken in assemblies and printed as if regularly sanctioned. Yet the composition of those bodies was increasingly curated. Men who might oppose were invited to speak and then quietly bankrupted or discredited. Formalism persisted: the votes, the chants, the gestures, but the substance shifted. This was not merely individual vanity. This was institutional engineering. Offices meant to check and balance were hollowed while their forms persisted. He held multiple positions sequentially and simultaneously in ways that the founding constitution of the Republic never intended. A consul's authority, mixed with provincial imperium and the command of loyal legions, produced a hybrid power that respected form while abandoning function. The daily grind of governance, sedition trials, allocations of grain, distribution of offices became a tactical field of accumulation. Laws were tools to be used, not boundaries to be obeyed. In the end, Caesar's household was a school of practical politics where appearances were as important as transactions. It taught a generation how to make power feel natural by dressing force in festival finery. It proved that you could preserve republican language while inventing personal rule. His private life, therefore, reads less like biography than like a manual of conversion. How to turn resources, money, soldiers, spectacle into an apparatus of quasi-sovereignty. And yet, even as this engine purred, the question that kept surprising his circle was not whether it could run, but whether it could be stopped. Small acts had produced giant loans, land allotments, purple robes, and carefully recorded votes, but giants fall where the foundation is weakest. The shape of that foundation would be tested on a single river's bank. What happened at the waterline would change everything and would force the Republic to choose between its laws and it. The Senate demanded his disarmament, return to Rome as a private citizen, or face prosecution for illegal conduct. That was not an idle threat. Legal immunity for provincial commanders was conditional. His enemies, those for whom the Republic's ancient constitution was both law and weapon, were prepared to prosecute. Caesar's choice was constrained. He could have marched into the courthouse and argued. He could have returned and risked an uncertain trial. Instead, he chose war. When he uttered, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, what he chose was to render every legal question subordinate to the will of an army. One small march, perhaps a brief step onto the southern bank, was not theatrical bravado, but a strategic sealing of an option set. In effect, if law threatened, convert the problem into a military solution. The initial march into Italy moved fast. Provinces offered tacit support. Some elements of the magistracy fled rather than face confrontation. The city emptied of its legitimate government the way a sound abandons a room, leaving behind an echo in the form of decrees issued in haste and in fear. There were sieges, skirmishes, but the civil war that followed was not a single-pitched battle. It was a scattering, a diffusion of violence across consular lines, across Italian towns, and across colonies where veterans found themselves on opposite sides. Rome's streets turned into theaters of reprisal. The human cost of that turn was not limited to generals and senators. Estimates compiled by cautious modern historians place Roman casualties in the civil wars at over 100,000 citizens, men, sometimes whole families, displaced, exiled, killed. That may sound like a number. It is also a texture. The clank of closing doors, the silent fields where the harvest went uncut, the unmarked graves strewn across provinces. When armies move through communities, commerce dies first, and then memory. Politically, the Rubicon crossing did something subtler and more ruinous than add casualties. It taught Rome that force could substitute for law. That lesson is practical. Men will follow the man who feeds them and who can protect them. The Roman soldier had always been loyal to his commander. Caesar codified that loyalty into institutional practice. He reoriented political calculations away from ballots and senatorial deliberation to the simpler arithmetic of obedience. The balance between civic authority and military loyalty tilted. This was not inevitable. The Republic had survived crises before. What made this collapse particularly profound was the system that had, over decades, allowed a single man to accumulate imperium that doubled as political leverage. Each law he passed, each veteran settled, each reform enacted after victory had been a tie anchoring soldiers to a person rather than to residential publica. The Rubicon was the moment those ties were made explicit and irreversible. Armies could now be used to alter the Constitution. After the crossing, the sequence of events reads like a contagion. The Senate's authority attenuated as magistrates fled or were co-opted. Fleet commanders took sides. Creditors called in loans. Provinces declared for allies or were pacified with gifts and clients. Where law once settled disputes, taxation, and civic order, now battles settled claims. That is not a simple inversion of function. It is a transformation. Governance became what a commander could secure, not what a constitution guaranteed. And then there was the aftermath of victory, the dispensing of rewards, land grants, debts written down. Public games expanded these acts, praised in the textbooks as benevolent, read like a ledger in which favors consolidate power. Veterans received allotments. Allies received privileges. Critics found themselves excluded. Reforms followed conquest. Policies were currency. This sequencing is crucial. It shows reform not as pretext, but as payoff. If you have seen the cinematic montage of Caesar returning to a grateful Rome, remember that the montage omits the ledger. Public festivals and monuments work as memory fixers. They do not show the exiles who disappeared, the taxation reconfigured, the senators who aligned not from conviction but calculation. Memory construction is never neutral. The spectacle of returning as Rome's savior worked precisely because it reoriented civic affection toward one man. The political order recalibrated itself around a center that was a person, not a set of institutions. The Rubicon also taught future aspirants. The precedent mattered more than the law. Ambitious commanders learned that with an army's loyalty and a spectacle's endorsement, constitutions could be remade. It is no accident that in the centuries after Caesar, the Roman world became comfortable with emperors and uncomfortable with republican deliberation. The crossing had not simply changed one career. It rewired how power could be won and held. But there is another, more corrosive effect to note. Legitimacy converted into sanctity. After the initial phase of consolidation, political actors discovered that legal forms could be kept while their meanings were stripped. Elections continued. Magistracies existed. The Senate met, but who chose its members had changed. The forms conferred a veneer of legality. That veneer was enough to make many Romans believe the Republic endured even as its foundations were replaced with patronage and force. One of the tragedies is that many Romans wanted a strong hand. They were tired of corruption, of paralysis, of brigandage in the provinces. Caesar diagnosed real failures. The fundamental moral problem is not the diagnosis, it is the remedy. To accept a cure that kills the patient invites reflection. When is efficiency worth the price of liberty? Caesar offered order at the cost of republican possibility. The Rubicon made that bargain irreversible. What followed the crossing was not only the consolidation of his capacity to rule, but also the setting off of an elaborate campaign to make the consolidation look inevitable and noble. Even as opponents fled and were silenced, the work of shaping public memory began immediately. The next acts were not all on the battlefield. They happened on the stage and in the archives. A murder in the Senate is dramatic and it happened, but that violence would soon be narrated, repackaged, and used as a hinge to justify what had been done. How do you reconcile a legal system with a man who has overturned it? Simple. You rewrite the past and sanctify the victor. The Rubicon broke the law. Words and images would soon be used to dress the breach as salvation. In the cold wake of that crossing, the Republic did not simply die from the spear. It died from a sequence of acts that made force feel preferable to deliberation. The river itself remained small. The consequences were vast. The question that follows is not only how he crossed, but how those who survived the immediate shocks allowed a new story to be written, one that turned treason into triumph. And that is the story of the finest art of politics, propaganda. What comes next is not strictly a matter of deeds, but of memory, of orations staged to inflame, wills read in the forum, coins that carry a face into every hand. The courtroom turned into a theater, and the theater did its work. What happens after violence is less dramatic than it appears. It is editing. You do not have to invent facts to rewrite a life. You only need to choose which facts to show and which to bury. The machine that took Caesar from traitor to hero did not start on the day of his death. It had been running for years. But in the hours after his stabbing, it switched from background to full power. Mark Antony's public performance at the Forum is the textbook case of immediate narrative capture. That famous funeral oration, whether you remember it as Shakespeare's soliloquy or as a historical maneuver, was not spontaneous grief. It was choreography. Antony displayed the bloody toga, read the will that left money and land to citizens, and, crucially, used rhetoric to turn private sorrow into public outrage. The crowd that erupted was not solely an expression of grief. It was a demonstration that perception could be mobilized. Chaos followed. Property was looted. Enemies of Caesar were attacked. The Senate shrank into silence. A single oration converted households into mobs and grief into a political instrument. Octavian's later work amplified what Antony began. He was younger, quieter, and infinitely more methodical. He did not merely argue for Caesar's memory, he institutionalized it. He commissioned poets and historians. Whether the omen was real or opportunistically interpreted is less important than the fact that belief hardened memory into doctrine. Once a man can be called God, opposition becomes not merely political but sacrilegious. Education sealed the deal. For generations, children learned the commentaries as exemplary Latin and the Gallic campaigns as strategic masterpieces. Consider how effective that is. The primary school text molds the next generation's mental map. Caesar's words taught language, rhetoric, and a vision of leadership that delivered results. Over time, criticism softened into footnotes. Thus, a literary self-portrait became an authoritative curriculum, and the author became the authority. Propaganda also has a taxonomic quality. It forgets some names so that a single name shines. Indigenous leaders, the millions who were enslaved or displaced, entire civic bodies, these appear as vectors in his narratives or disappear altogether. The archive that survives is partly an archive of omission. Where a battlefield should have left mounds and ruins, there is sometimes a plain field and a monument. Where a populace should have roared with protest, there are records of grateful petitions. That is not always fabrication. Sometimes it is the power of selection. The methods used to manufacture the myth were not primitive. They were modern. Prizes and honors were bestowed and recorded. Poets were paid. Statues commissioned in picturesque ways. Laws passed that memorialized restoration. Public festivals turned into instruments of memory. A triumphal rout became a school lesson in civic myth. Memory was systematized into spectacle. Perhaps the most insidious tactic was to reframe opponents as villains and thus justify elimination. Cicero's speeches, which had been barometers of Republican resistance, were marginalized, and voices like his were later used as examples in cautionary tales. Some critics met legal death. Others found themselves in exile or impoverished. The effect was clear: to create an environment where dissent was costly. When history is written by victors, the cost of disagreeing includes not only reputation but survival. What followed outside Rome reinforced the picture. Successive rulers Charlemagne, Napoleon, and beyond saw in Caesar an exemplar. They copied his portraits, his administrative centralizations, and his claims to exceptionalism. The Renaissance humanists who revived classical texts often presented Caesar as the model of political virtue when convenient, eliding the republican dislocations that accompanied his rise. In later centuries, imperial projects used him as an ancestral figure. It is easy to find Caesar in the rhetoric of empire because he offers a tidy script: decisive man, reforms for the people, glorious wars, tragic assassination. And in the modern era, cinema and television performed the final translation. Where once a carved statue stood in a forum, now a film still hangs in a museum of images. Movies like Cleopatra, series like Rome, and games like Total War offered dramatized, aestheticized versions of conquest, often stripped of victims and systemic cruelty. Entertainment translates complexity into narrative that sells. The human cost becomes background. A hero becomes a protagonist in a marketable story. But propaganda is subtle not only in what it affirms, but in how it normalizes rhetorical shortcuts. Crossing the Rubicon becomes metaphor for boldness, not treason. Let them hate me becomes aphorism for leadership that prizes order over consent. These phrases travel far from their contexts and are reanimated by leaders eager to claim decisive virtue. Caesar's case thus provides a ready-made logic for future autocrats. Efficiency legitimizes exception. Spectacle warrants obedience. The machinery that made Caesar into legend also built an apparatus that naturalized personal rule. Coins, temples, educational syllabi, myths, court histories, each element built a scaffolding. Over time, the scaffolding becomes architecture. Successive regimes did not need to invent a new mythology. They simply borrowed and rebranded. In that borrowing lies the true genius of the campaign. It made a historical actor into an archetype useful to many masters. What remains is a difficult duality. On one hand, Caesar did enact reforms that had administrative benefits. He reformed calendars, built infrastructure, and restructured legal processes that improved efficiency in certain areas. On the other hand, these improvements gain moral ambiguity when they are conditioned by patronage networks, enforced by force, and memorialized by myth. The propaganda machine ensured that the positive measures would be remembered without their costs. It also taught later generations that the ends could justify the dismantling of institutional restraints. The net result: a man and a memory that performed different functions in different eras. For monarchs and dictators, Caesar offered validation. For reformers, a model of decisive action. For artists, a character of dramatic possibilities. This elasticity is the final achievement of the propaganda. By becoming all things to all people, the real Caesar was effaced behind an image that could be reinterpreted indefinitely. So what was lost in the process? Not merely a political system, but an ethical baseline. When a republic can be reconstituted as a stage for a single life, public judgment migrates from deliberation to spectacle. That migration is not an accident, nor is it merely historical curiosity. It is a template, a playbook. The tools used to recast a coup as salvation speechmaking, spectacle, coinage, scriptural curriculum remain available to any modern power that seeks them. If you look closely, you will recognize the pattern in later histories. The making of a myth was less about the man than about the institutions that could be shaped to remember him kindly. That is why the story of Caesar's myth is not just ancient lore. It is a living lesson in how memory can be engineered. The next step in a truthful account is to construct a portrait that holds both sides. The reforms and the revenues, the calendars and the coffins, the public works and the private piles of obligation. It is the only way to keep the warning clear. Efficiency without accountability breeds a different kind of ruin. After the propaganda, only a method remained: clear eyes on the evidence, and an insistence on the difference between benefit and legitimacy. The task now is to strip away the polished images and to ask, who did these acts help, and what did they cost? That is where we must go next, with documents in hand, and with the memory of the Rubicon shadowing every step. Stripping away 2 millennia of celebration and omission, a clearer, more uncomfortable Julius Caesar begins to take shape. This is not a caricature, neither saint nor cartoon villain, but a composite portrait assembled from documents, monuments, silences, and consequences. The task is to hold his talents and his crimes together, to admit both administrative skill and institutional sabotage without flattening either into legend or caricature. Start with character. Caesar was unmistakably brilliant, quick in judgment, brilliant with logistics, hypnotic with prose. He read situations the way other men read weather. In a council room, he could map rivalries like constellations. In a camp, he could measure the exact number of loaves needed to keep a legion marching for a month. That practical competence is part of what made him magnetic. But alongside competence lived a hunger for recognition and a comfort with personal power. Where others saw a republic of offices, Caesar increasingly saw a stage built for a single actor. He wanted not only victory, but the story of victory to carry his face. On motives, reductionism fails. He was not driven by a single, clean aim. Only ambition fits that description. He was driven by layered motives, to survive political attacks, to secure wealth and loyalty for himself and his followers, and to inscribe his name on the public map. These motives are not exotic. They are human, and they explain decisions that political rhetoric cannot. Sometimes his choices look defensive, multiplying patronage to ensure against prosecution. Sometimes they read like experiments in personal rule, appointing magistrates, controlling grain distributions, centralizing decision-making. When you put these choices end to end, they form a strategy, a way to turn short-term advantage into durable dominance. Method matters. See, the contrast between public magnanimity and private calculation is striking. In Rome, he could stage clemency, pardoning some opponents. Showing restraint while abroad, his campaigns often meant massacre and enslavement. The difference is not mere hypocrisy, it is instrumental logic. Public mercy in the city secured votes and images. Ruthless efficiency in the provinces secured resources and fear. In one case, clemency brought a senator back into the fold. In another, slaughter settled the frontier. Both moves built power, but each spoke to a different audience, the one domestic, the other external. That duality reveals a man who could calibrate morality to political effect. Institutional tactics reveal his real innovation. He kept Republican forms while hollowing their content. Elections were held, magistrates named. The Senate met, but the mechanisms had been altered. He filled the Senate with allies, controlled appointments, and made legal forms instruments of personal will. Where the Republic once distributed power through diffuse competition, Caesar centralized the levers. That may have produced order, it certainly produced dependency. The danger is not only in the concentration of decisions, but in the reorientation of loyalty from the state to the man who dispensed favors. Caesar's veterans, settled on lands he awarded and maintained by pensions he approved, were not anonymous citizens, but personal clients. That structural change soldiers as political property was his enduring gift to successors. His reforms were selective and functional. Calendar reform mattered. It reduced administrative confusion. Public works roads, forums, grain stores improved life in certain measurable ways. Debt decrees and land grants addressed real social stresses. Yet the timing and the beneficiaries are relevant. Many reforms followed military victories and were instruments of reward. Land settlements prioritized veterans. Debt relief had loopholes. The pattern suggests that policy often served as payoff rather than principled program. Efficiency was real, but so was clientele building. Ambition turned increasingly theatrical. The trappings of divinity crept into his life by degrees. Purple borders, honors that historically belonged to gods or kings, a public image that moved beyond mortal praise. Interpretations vary. Some contemporaries saw only deserved honors, others saw sacrilege. What matters is the effect. Once honors cross a certain threshold, dissent becomes not only political but sacrilegious. To oppose the man is to risk appearing ungodly, ungrateful, or treacherous. That is a powerful deterrent. Institutional safeguards, trial by peers, electoral oversight lose their force when social language frames opposition as a moral vice. Yet this portrait must preserve nuance. Caesar was neither a monster nor an apologist construct. He showed loyalty to friends, generosity to cities that benefited Rome, and genuine administrative curiosity. He could be personally modest in private, and yet performatively majestic in public. He wept at statues of Alexander. He could inspire devotion. These contradictions matter because they are what made his project plausible. People could admire him and, at the same time, be used by him. If he had been transparently cruel, fewer would have followed. If he had been only an administrator, fewer would have remembered. His ability to combine the plausible with the audacious is what made his rule both effective and tragic. Where historians disagree, the script must be honest about probability and evidence. Casualties in Gaul are debated. Sources vary. Some ancient authors amplify, others minimize. The archaeological record fills some gaps, but leaves others blank. When we say genocide, we are invoking a modern category that fits certain behaviors: mass killings, displacement, enslavement, yet applying it across epochs must be cautious. What stands firm is that his campaigns produced vast human suffering, seizure of peoples, and systemic enslavement on a large scale. That cost is part of his record, a cost often sanitized in civic memory. Finally, What does this more honest portrait mean beyond biography? It maps a syndrome of political engineering, diagnose problems, centralize power, reward loyalists, neutralize rivals, and legitimize through spectacle. That sequence is not unique to him. It recurs when strongmen convert crises into permanent authority. The lesson is structural, not merely personal. Caesar showed how a talented leader can convert competence into monopoly, and how institutional erosion can be gradual, legalistic, and ultimately irreversible. This portrait ends with a caution. The danger of such a figure is not merely the deeds he performs, but the machinery he installs that outlives him. The architecture remains soldiers loyal to commanders, public festivals that sanctify leaders, curricular choices that canonize one voice. The question that follows is not whether he was cruel or brilliant, but whether the systems he created could have been preserved differently. And if not, what choices did Romans make, collectively, that allowed a republic to be remodeled around a man? The answer is coming next. It ties the past to our present. But first, the legacy, and how it keeps working in ways we barely notice. A final fact hangs in the air: if memory can be engineered, what else might we be taught to revere? That question will follow, but the machines are already turning. Caesar's shadow moves forward into modernity, not as biography, but as a script. The machinery that turned a coup into a coronation survived him. Administrative centralization, military loyalty as the determinant of authority, and the cultural techniques that sanctify winners. The term Caesarism captures this pattern. But to see the full scope, break his legacy into three interlocking planes: political, religious, ideological, and cultural, commercial, and follow a few clear trails. Politically, the most direct inheritance is the normalizing of emergency powers. Caesar's precedent made extraordinary commands plausible. Successors could claim necessity. The late Republic had legal instruments for temporary dictatorships. He made them quasi-permanent. That precedent means that in later centuries, leaders could justify centralization as a corrective to dysfunction. Napoleon knew this script when he called himself consul for life. Modern authoritarian governments reuse the same logic. Crisis requires concentration. Concentration yields order. Order justifies permanence. The mechanism is old, the rhetoric refined, and the pattern reproducible. The religious and ideological plane is subtle but profound. Deifying a mortal, declaring someone divus, does more than flatter. It co-opts sacred language. When a governing class can sanctify its leader, political critique becomes heresy. The Roman precedent allowed later rulers to borrow sanctity without the old city's sacral institutions. They used religion as legitimation. In modern vocabularies, this can look secular, patriotic duty, or national security, but the function is the same. Sacralization of a person substitutes moral veto for legal debate. Caesar's cult gave successors a template. Blend policy with providence and make opposition an offense against order itself. Culture and commerce cement the memory. Coins with a living face, statues in public squares, school texts that canonize a version of events. These are the mundane technologies of memory. Think of the denarius that carried a ruler's portrait into every market stall, or a school curriculum that uses one man's commentaries as exemplars of language and virtue. Over centuries, these small, repeated encounters create an intuitive familiarity. People feel as if they've always known him. The modern equivalents are films, TV series, blockbuster biographies, and iconic imagery. Hollywood streamlined Caesar into a romantic archetype. Renaissance humanists polished him into a figure of civic genius. Each layer repeated the story until doubt felt like eccentricity. Consider how images do heavy lifting. A statue on a forum, a coin in a pocket, a line in a schoolbook, each is a tiny contract. This is worth believing. Multiply that by generations, and a selective past hardens into received truth. The visual language matters because it requires no complicated proof. It requires only repetition. That is why autocrats long for cameras, for pageantry, for curricula, because they know the quiet arithmetic. The ideological uses are obvious in times of crisis. Governments promise stability by invoking ancient exemplars of strong rule. The rhetoric is simple. Democracy failed you. One strong leader can fix it. That pitch is older than modern nationalism. Caesar sold it. Napoleon refined it. Later leaders commercialized it. Each act layered new legitimacy atop the original precedent. The modern danger is not the past repeating exactly, but the template persisting. Emergency, consolidation, legitimization. There is an ethical erosion too. When institutional outcomes, roads built, grain stocked, taxes standardized are weighed more heavily than legal processes, the moral baseline shifts. People begin to accept that ends can validate means. Caesar's achievements are real and measurable. The trap lies in making success the sole criterion for legitimacy. That trade-off, efficiency for liberty, reappears in contemporary debates whenever citizens choose stability over process. This legacy also mutates into culture wars. Some identify Caesar as a reformer when convenient, others as a villain when politically useful. The elasticity of his image makes him a versatile symbol. That versatility explains part of his longevity. He is deployable. Leaders on the left and the right have invoked his example to argue for sweepingly different projects. The image is a Rorschach test. People project onto it their own needs: order, reform, glory. Finally, the lesson carries a direct civic warning. Memory is engineered. Institutions that depend on forms, elections, legislatures, courts are vulnerable not merely to armed takeover, but to slow capture. The capture works by procedural edits, by patronage, by shifting loyalties. When the scaffolding is hollowed, the veneer remains. Citizens, taught to read the veneer as reality, become complicit through indifference. If we do not interrogate the appearances, parades, monuments, schoolbooks, we risk being governed by myth more than law. So when you next hear a leader described as decisive or restorative, remember the architecture that made those words powerful for Caesar. The story is not only about him. It is about a durable method for remaking politics. The final, stingy observation is the most uncomfortable. Caesar's greatest gift to future autocrats was not a calendar or a road, but a template of memory making that still works perfectly today. The pieces are in place. The question is whether we will recognize the script when it plays out in our own time. What will you see the next time a crowd in your city is invited to celebrate a leader and not a constitution? The next act begins quietly, and often it begins with applause. You watched a body on the Senate floor, and then watched how a whole civilization learned to applaud a life that had burned the house down. We traced the myth, pried at its seams, walked the corridors of power, and followed the trail from a river crossing to a global vocabulary that still justifies emergency rule. The record is clear in outline. Facts dominate the frame, but interpretations shade the edges. Some things we can say as near certain. Caesar engineered loyalty, centralized authority, and used spectacle to neutralize dissent. Other things remain debated. The precise casualty totals in Gaul, the motives of private conversations, the degree to which later readers reshaped every source. So here is the question that closes this dossier, and it is deliberately blunt. If a republic can be dismantled half a step at a time, replacing votes with favors, law with spectacle, memory with monuments, how many of the political necessities you accept today are merely rehearsals for a similar conversion? Thank you for staying with this investigation. If this unpacking matters to you, subscribe to follow more dossiers like this one. Tell us in the comments where you learned your version of this story: school, film, or family, and which detail surprised you most. Mark your city too. It helps map how these myths travel. This episode is one file among many in a growing archive. There are other figures, other countrysides of memory, waiting to be opened. The work of unmaking myth has only begun.